Scripture reading today is from the book of Luke, chapter 24, 13 to 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you're walking along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who is a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of us, those who were with us, went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked on ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord for the people of the Lord.
Well, it's the 3rd Sunday since Easter. Well, we had Easter, and then we had, the next week, and then we had the next week. And here we are again, standing with Cleopas, and I'm guessing it's Cleopas's wife. The scriptures don't tell us, but that's who I guess it is. And they are encountered by Jesus just hours after the resurrection. So even though Easter was 2-3 weeks ago, we're still on Easter. We're still stuck on Easter. And boy, has it been a busy day for Jesus. It's been a long day for Jesus. He raised from the dead. He has a conversation with Mary Magdalene in the garden, who mistakes him for the gardener. And then he mysteriously appears to the disciples who are in hiding behind closed doors. And there's no windows to open and close. He just appears in the upper room where he had gathered with them on that Thursday evening, just before, to celebrate the Passover. This is one of my favorite post-Easter stories. And one of the most interesting facts about the story is that this story contains all of the elements of worship. All of them. Listen to this. Two people are walking together, and they are joined by a guest. And the scriptures are opened and they are read. And Kevin, I'm glad you chose to read the scripture, because that is part of worship and why we hear it every week. And so the three of them decide that they're going to stop. And the two of them ask the guest, "Will you not join us in our home?" They had walked that day probably about 7 miles. Remember, Jesus had just been crucified, and he walked 7 miles. And there they are. And Jesus reveals himself to them. And the story closes. They tell us that were not our hearts warmed while we were walking with this dude down the road? Didn't we feel something burning within us? And you know what they decided to do? They decided to go and share the good news. This is why it is so important to us that we gather to worship. Because not only does it warm our hearts, but it changes us so that we want to go out into the world and share that love with others. Because Christ has revealed himself to us here and there, especially there, because that's there that they recognize Jesus. Another part of the story has to do with the two disciples who are walking down the road to Emmaus, just in deep sorrow and not able to wrap their heads around what had just happened. And they didn't understand why Jesus had to die, and then all of a sudden he disappears. And so when this stranger sides up with them, and he sees that they're feeling so dejected, he says, "What's wrong, guys? Why you look so sad?" And Cleopas, love his answer. "We had hoped. We had hoped." These words, "we had hoped," seemed to me just to be heartbreaking words. We had hoped. They had hoped that Jesus had come and that Jesus would redeem Israel and that he would free them from Roman oppression and he would establish a new kingdom there and bring prosperity back to the people who now, many of them, had become enslaved to the Romans and feared the Romans. They had hoped, but now their hope was vanquished. Three of the saddest words in the New Testament: we had hoped. The great American novelist Ernest Hemingway was once given a challenge to write a short story in 6 words. 6 words. You should try that sometime. And so on a napkin, he wrote these words: "For sale, baby shoes, never used." It's not just the tragedy of what happened that hurts, but the gaping hole of all that could have happened but didn't. We've all had hopes that didn't come to fruition, right? All of us. You may have hoped at some point in your life that when you achieved a certain age, that you would also have achieved certain accomplishments. And you get to that age and they're not there yet. And then you go a few years beyond and you see that they're never going to happen. It's a degree of success, whatever success might mean. But for a variety of reasons, the success that you had hoped for was never found. You may have hoped that your relationship with your parents might have been a bit different than the relationship that you had, yet the sad reality is that we all face circumstances that we have no control over. And so we just have to kind of cope with, well, I didn't have the parent that I wanted or even needed. I had hoped to reconcile. This is personal for me. I had hoped to reconcile with my sister named Michelle who was the one of my siblings closest in age to me. But on Mother's Day of 2015, she took her life, and we never had the opportunity to reconcile with each other. I had also hoped that when my dad became ill, that I would be able to be there with him in his last day, in his last breath. But because of COVID, we were not allowed to be there. So he died alone. We had hoped becomes a chapter in all of our stories, right? I think it's good that today, weeks after Easter, we're still focusing on the resurrection experiences of the disciples on the day of resurrection. They're all just deeply saddened by the event. So I think we can resonate with the phrase, but we had hoped. In each of the stories that we've discussed, be it the disciples in hiding, or Mary not recognizing Jesus, or Thomas doubting, and also the two on the road to Emmaus. Those two, we too have difficulty recognizing Jesus when he's present among us. So as Cleopas and friend tread down the road of despair and doubt, and we've all walked down a road of despair and doubt before, we hear them reflecting on the week's event that began with the supposed Messiah riding in to the city of Jerusalem with so much excitement, and big parades were thrown, and they could imagine Jesus being their new king, and they shouted out, "Save us," and they believed he would. And the mighty Roman army came in at the same time at an opposite gate where Jesus came in. And we know what happens during that week, don't we? They had hoped that Jesus would defeat their Roman occupiers. And so Jesus, walking with Cleopas and Cleopas' wife, turns to them and says, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Why are you so sad and dejected? And I love Cleopas. He says, are you serious? Hadn't you heard what happened? And Jesus just acts very coy. No, what? And so Cleopas says, well, then let me tell you what happened. 3 years ago, we met a man, and he became our dear friend. We ate with him. We listened to him. We traveled with him. We listened to his stories. We watched his incredible miracles, and we were just convinced that he was the long-awaited Messiah. And just 1 week ago, when the Romans arrived in Jerusalem with their mighty army, Jesus too came into the city, and we had hoped that he would be the king that would liberate us from our despair. And Jesus says, yeah? Tell me more. Tell me more. And then Cleopas responded, 3 days ago, after we had celebrated the Passover with him in an upper room, we had an incredible meal together, remembering our people's liberation from the Egyptian army. Our king was arrested for no reason, and the next day they crucified him on a cross between two common thieves. And when he died, they put him in a tomb. They sealed it with a stone that could not be moved. And they put Roman guards there to make sure nothing happened to the body. And Jesus says, tell me more. Tell me more. As if he doesn't know, right? Well, when the morning came, these women show up to prepare his body for burial. But instead of the tomb was opened, and there were angels there, and the angels told the women, "Why are you here? He is risen." And so the women get so excited, and they go back and they tell people. And Jesus goes, "Women? Yeah, women. It was the women." And Jesus, I can see him just wryly smiling. So Jesus starts a Bible study, as Jesus is prone to do, as they're walking, going back to the time of Moses and the prophets, reminding them all, it's a 7-mile walk. You could do a decent-sized Bible study there. Remembered, he's reminding them everything that they had learned since they were children, growing up in the temple, confirming everything that the supposed Messiah had told them already. In a short time, their lost hope that they had completely lost began to be rekindled in their hearts as this unknown person speaks to them. And so they invite the stranger, "Could you please stay the night with us? It's late. And we're going to prepare a small meal for you. Fish and chips." And the stranger says, "Why not?" So as they all sat down for the fish fry, Jesus takes some bread, and he blesses the bread, and he breaks it, and he gives it to them. And then they see. Their eyes are opened. Whatever scales had been there drop off. And they're so excited. But then he's gone. He disappears. They had seen the Lord. And so they turn their fish and the bread into fish sandwiches. First time human beings had ever had a fish sandwich. True story. And they dash back 7 miles at night to Jerusalem to tell the disciples. They said, "We've seen the Lord. He's risen." Just as the women had said. Imagine that. The women were right. I'm convinced, I'm just convinced in my heart that even today, 2,000 years later, Jesus shows up in the same way. In the midst of our daily lives, whether we see it or not, whether we're driving to work, our encounters in restaurants and grocery stores, in serving the poor at the food pantry, Jesus is there. When we come into worship, when we have Bible study, when we gather together to eat, Jesus shows up. I've seen it, and so have you. You've seen it. When a friend is healed from cancer after countless prayers, when a loved one has passed after a long illness, when a job opens up after you've been unemployed for a while, when a broken relationship is mended, when a child is born, you've seen it. When a rose blooms after a long winter, you've seen it. And we have experienced the resurrected Messiah. I have witnessed people who believe that they had lost everything, but piece by piece, in due time, the pieces are put back together. So I understand losing hope. We had hoped, but in due time. We're similar to those disciples who fall asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus had asked them, "Please stay awake and say some prayers for me, would you?" We sometimes fail to see Jesus in the ordinary as well as the extraordinary events of our lives, yet there he is, walking beside us, taking on our sorrows, listening to our broken dreams and gently reminding us to not surrender and to trust that He is with us. In due time, our hope, our hearts are rekindled, and we will look back and see that Jesus was with us the whole time. I invite you to stand with me and sing our hymn of discipleship, Break Thou the Bread of Life.
Break thou the bread of life, dear Lord, to me. As thou didst break the loaves beside the sea, within the sacred page, I seek thee, Lord. My spirit pants for thee, O living word. Bless thou the truth, dear Lord, to me. As thou didst bless the bread by Galilee, then shall all bondage cease, all fetters fall, and I shall find my peace, my all in all. Thou art the bread of life, O Lord, to me. Thy holy word, the truth that saveth me. Give me to eat and live with thee above. Teach me to love thy truth, for thou